potentially reconsider our role as natural medicine practitioners. And I think a lot of our listeners are also in their own healthcare modalities who are now very much in a situation where they actually have to say, well, do I have a new role to play now post all of this? Because are we now saying that we have to run broader testing to actually assess people's risks towards this kind of thing? And how do we go about educating people in relation to do that? How do we work with other modalities potentially to enhance this process as well? Because it does seem to me, and you touched on this a little bit earlier, that minimum we've got another 18 months of this. As far as the phasing and waving, or at least that's what I'm calling it at the moment, and that we're getting waves and phasing back the containment or phasing forward the containment. Do you have any comments on that, and if you've had any thoughts about these new things that we may actually have to start really concentrating on? You touched on obesity, you've touched on the metabolic disease. Is there anything else post-viral now that we need to start considering for people?
Let's go into the post-viral side of it a bit, because that after all is the main theme of what we're wanting to talk about today, and I think that's a good preamble. I guess just the last thing to say before we end the preamble part is that there is a hypothalamic and limbic response. The amygdala can be highly activated, and when we start talking about the stress to the cells that viruses can cause, we start talking about electron steal, and we start talking about the mitochondria. Now, I might have introduced a few terms there that people are not all that familiar with, and it comes out of the work by Navio in the cell danger response. But just to hook back before we dive into the sort of biochemic angle of that, back at the macro scale, our brains and the hypothalamus and chronic stress. Now, many people have undergone traumatic life incidents as a child, and that has a massive effect and a permanent effect. And so reactivation of stress responses is much higher. And we know there's a bunch of different things that happen in the brain as a result. Methylation is different in the brain. The amygdala is more highly activated. The pro-inflammatory response is kicked off by excess cortisol for too long. Then the insulin starts going high, because it's a kind of a race between cortisol and insulin, and so one goes up, the other comes to join it, so you start to get that weird effect of, even though there's corticosteroids in the system, you're still getting a pro-inflammatory effect if it's chronic, and they're kind of like, aren't steroids all about, short term, but long term, no, it starts to fire backwards. So all of that, probably enough about the predispositions, and of course when we listen to our patients who have CFS, they have often got some other major life event, like a loss of a loved one, or an affair in a relationship, or some sort of big trigger that knocks them back. And again, if they have those more early life experiences, that can be a much bigger trigger for them. So look, what I'm talking about there is the whole brain angle of how you can go into chronic fatigue is substantial. It's one of the ways you get there, and it's very legitimate. The studies are very profound on it. So it's like, so it turns out the mitochondria are sensitive to all sorts of environmental factors, including the stress that our brains have experienced is one of the ways they go down. And then there's the methylation and detoxification issues that lead to ADHD and the autistic spectrum, and in the younger ones, and then in the older ones it leads to some of the Alzheimer's and so on. Parkinson's disease is the other one I want to get out. But in general, what we're saying is that that whatever way it's ending up, that there's chronic inflammatory response in the system, down at the mitochondrial level, that's where a lot of the damage that leads to chronic fatigue is occurring, because the mitochondria, after all, are the energy production units of every cell, thousands in most cells. So, that's, if the mitochondria are going down with whatever it is, whether it's a viral attack, or whether it's a heavy metal or gluten load attack, or a chronic stress response, they can all be factors that are relevant. And I might say, here in Hong Kong, one of the most predominant things that stops our patients from getting well, a couple of us here have kind of made the conclusion, if the patient's not well, we do a mycotoxins test and discover that, hey, they've got a mouldy house, and that's what's screwing up their mitochondria. So, Phil, your point about looking further into patients by doing more testing is very relevant. Just to hook back to that comment came out of, we were talking about DNA. I like if the patient has been with me for 5 or 6 sessions and they're starting to go beyond their initial reason for coming. And we're thinking about letting them go into the long term, and you're thinking, well, what is it I'm going to say to this person on the more or less last visit? And I like to offer them before that to do a good comprehensive DNA, because I can then target which of the areas in their system need that long-term support and try to drive it home. And we're talking really forever. You can't fix the genes, and they tend to manifest their problems more and more as you get older, so stick with it. So I do like to offer the DNA as at least a final kind of place to go.